Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 121. And today I'm going to talk about Oliver Nelson's fantastic album from 1961, The Blues and the Abstract Truth on Impulse. And what I have here is a Japanese pressing of same, which means, of course, deliciously quiet vinyl. And there's Oliver himself with Eric Dolphy and Freddie Hubbard. And anyway, it sounds like any Impulse record from that particular era, just amazing. If you had to categorize it in terms of the type of jazz, it's basically a post-bop record, but it has elements of all sorts of different eras of jazz, from pre-war swing onto bop, post-bop, and onto the new thing as well with Eric Dolphy's presence. So it's really varied, really interesting. So Oliver Nelson comes from St. Louis. He was born there in 1932. In 1950, when he was only 18, he joined Louis Jordan's big band, playing tenor sax and also arranging. In 1952, Nelson was drafted into the Marines. He did serve and he did go overseas, but in a musical capacity in the Marines band, and he went to Korea and Japan. And it's Japan where, as it happens, he ends up encountering a significant musical influence because he goes to see the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra. This was not something, as a young black person in St. Louis, that had really been available to him. And it's there that he's exposed for the very first time to modern composers. And this, for him, was a life-changing experience because up until that point, he'd assumed that symphonic music and orchestral music and arranged music was inseparable from 19th century classical music. Totally turned his world upside down, and he decided then and there he wanted to become a composer. After his service in the Marines is complete, he returns to St. Louis, and between 1954 and 1958, he picks up 2 degrees, one at Washington University in St. Louis and one at Lincoln University, ending up with a Master's in Musical Composition. At this point, he had the qualification, but as a black composer in St. Louis in 1958, there just weren't any opportunities. So in that year, he moves to New York City, and pretty soon he becomes the house arranger for the Apollo Theater in Harlem. He's writing, composing, playing. He gets a job with Louis Bellson's big band in 1959. And around the same time, he signs a contract with Prestige Records, a very well-known jazz label of the day. His career at this point is moving into overdrive, and in 1960 and 61, he plays with Count Basie, with Duke Ellington, and he has a stint with Quincy Jones. He's continuing to play the tenor sax, but he's getting much better known as a composer and arranger. He was a good player, but that wasn't where his greatest strength lay, and I don't really think it's any surprise that he ends up hooking up with Basie and Ellington and Jones, 3 of the greatest minds in 20th century music history when it came to understanding the not just composition itself, but the composition of a band and the interplay between the instruments and just being able to map all that out in your head. Under his contract with Prestige at this time, between 1959 and 1961, he puts out a string of albums. Most of these were small group sessions. One of them was a big band date, and his versatility and his skill was beginning to get noticed, and he was getting a lot of acclaim within the jazz world. That led to playing with people like Eric Dolphy, Roy Haynes, Kenny Dorham, and a whole bunch of either up-and-coming or well-known players. In this period, his true breakthrough comes into the top rank of the jazz world with the release of this album. Following its release, his career as a composer blossomed and he got a lot more big band work. Eventually, however, he decides he needs to change his scene, and so he moves out to Los Angeles in 1967. And there he becomes extensively involved in writing movie and TV scores. He wrote the theme to Columbo, he wrote the theme to Ironside, he wrote the theme to The $6 Million Man, and he also scored the movie Last Tango in Paris, starring Marlon Brando. And so by the mid-1970s, a little more than a decade, Oliver Nelson had gone from somebody basically an unknown, coming from St. Louis with a music degree, to being on top of the music scene in Hollywood. Of course, we'll never know what more he could have achieved because tragically, at age 43 in 1975, Nelson dies suddenly of a heart attack. But one thing is certain, with this particular album, he left a lasting mark in the jazz world. This album was produced by the legendary producer Creed Taylor in one of his last acts at Impulse Records before leaving for Verve. As with so many albums that Taylor produces, it's recorded by the legendary engineer Rudy Van Gelder, and no surprise, it sounds fantastic, as I mentioned earlier. The lineup on here is a 7-piece group. Nelson himself plays tenor sax and alto sax, and he is surrounded by a total all-star cast. Freddie Hubbard is on trumpet, Eric Dolphy is on alto sax and flute, the great Bill Evans is on piano, and this is the only time where both Nelson and Evans appear on the same record. Evans is joined in the rhythm section by Paul Chambers on bass and Roy Haynes on drums. The 7th and last member of the group is George Barrow, who contributes on baritone sax. There are 6 songs in the record, and all of them were recorded in one day on February 23, 1961, at Van Gelder's studio in New Jersey. All 6 of the tracks on here are written by Nelson. If you can draw a distinction between an album which is very much a musician's album and an album which is very much a composer's album or an arranger's album, this is clearly very much in the latter. Although, of course, he is a musician, this album and its contribution to the jazz canon is all about the cleverness, the intricacies, the beauty of the arrangements that are here in these 6 songs. It's definitely not a modal record like Kind of Blue, and it's in no way as minimalist as the sound on that particular record. This is much more thought out. This is much more clearly composed and arranged. But it's not totally unrelated to that album either, not least because both Paul Chambers and Bill Evans played on the Davis album. It was immensely successful when it came out. Critically, it was very well reviewed at the time and subsequently as well. Although Nelson's career subsequently took off in all kinds of directions, as I mentioned, he did return to this theme and this idea a few years later with an album called More Blues and the Abstract Truth. Totally different lineup of musicians and really not nearly as good an album. Side 1 starts with the famous track Stolen Moments, which is just an amazing piece of music. It has that famous head arrangement with 3 very different aspects to it. You've got a blistering solo from Freddie Hubbard right off the bat, the leader himself with a mesmerizing, gorgeous turn on tenor, and then a really sumptuous solo from Evans. There's so much to like about the song, the melody, the arrangement of the head section, the solos, which are all so different and inspired, and yet they all totally work together. It's really a piece of music which is an essential part of the jazz canon. The next track is Hoedown, which is kind of all over the map. I don't think in as good a way as the very first track, but it's still a very interesting song. It's probably the track in the album which has the most diverse influences because you've got a little bit of swing in here, you've got some big band stuff, you've got some bop, you've got some post-bop, and you have Dolphy, who is, I think, in his solo, very much giving you some avant-garde flavor, some new thing. And incidentally, I think Dolphy here sounds a heck of a lot like Ornette Coleman. It's a fascinating track. Does it work from the perspective of the listener? Yeah, I think it does. The final song on the first side is Cascades, which is based on an exercise which Nelson used to work on saxophone while he was in college. The real stars here are Evans, Chambers, and Haynes. Chambers and Haynes are just such a good rhythm section, and you get to hear them in all their glory for an extended period of time here, probably a couple of minutes, because Evans plays this extended solo which just builds in intensity, and you really get all 3 of those fantastic players just locked in for that period of time. The first track on the album is great, but this is also another major highlight. Side 2 of this album is also pretty good if it doesn't quite reach the heights of the first side. And like the first side, all 3 of these songs are rooted in the blues, perhaps a little more tightly related to the traditional 12-bar form than on the first side. That's particularly true of Yearnin', which is very clearly a 12-bar blues. This is just delicious from the get-go with Chambers' bass, Evans vamping over top of that, and then Dolphy has this otherworldly solo. It just is incredible the sound that he could make come out of an alto sax. And you can see why Coltrane held him in such esteem, really seeing him as a peer. Nobody else sounded like that. The final 2 songs in the record are dedicated to Nelson's eldest sister and younger sister, respectively. The first one, Butch and Butch, is your standard head arrangement. I think it's okay. It's a bit big bandy for me. That's just kind of more my taste than anything else. I think there are lots of people who would really like this, but when things get a little too big bandy, that's not really my thing. The last song on the album, which is dedicated to his younger sister, is called Teeny's Blues. This song has 2 different solos on alto by Eric Dolphy. I don't think he quite gets to the place he got to on Yearnin', but he's always interesting. And the contrast is then fascinating because Nelson then comes in and plays alto as well. And the difference in the tone and the temperament of the 2 players is striking. The Blues and the Abstract Truth is an album which tackles a whole bunch of different jazz styles, tackles in the sense of incorporating them into cohesive pieces of music. There are also 7 different players here, and these aren't bit part players. For the most part, these are the stars of the jazz world. So there is a ton to accomplish. All these different styles blended together, all these different players with their moments in the sun. It's a wonderfully experimental album, and it's extremely ambitious, and it could so easily have gone horribly wrong. Happily, it didn't. This is a triumph. It's a challenge to bring all these styles together because not every listener is going to like all those particular styles. And it's true, I find myself listening to this every now and then in certain tracks saying, this part I'm not so keen about. This sounds, as I mentioned earlier, too big bandy for me or whatever. But the key thing is it's constantly dynamic. Those impressions never linger. Nelson is always onto something else, always bringing in some new kind of influence and some new kind of a take. In other words, it's fresh all the way through all 6 tracks in the record. It could have been a hodgepodge, but Nelson is supremely successful in tying this all together. It's an immense achievement, and it's one of the great jazz records of the 1960s. It's a 5 out of 5 for me.